Okay, so once again, good afternoon. I am Kelsey Aho, a master's student here at EIF. I'm in the Arctic and Northern Studies department, and I'm also in the Resilience and Adaptation program. So most of the work I'm going to be talking about today, talking about different scales and different co-management happening in the Bering Strait, comes from the research I've been doing for my master's thesis, but I've also included some jumps to look at how these two examples or case studies, what steps they've gone through in the EA to management, so that approach. And I'm really interested in talking more to everyone about co-management and a lot of the overlap. I see that the frameworks are actually quite similar, even though this is an older term and what they've been practicing in Alaska for a really long time. Both have a need for broad agreement amongst stakeholders, and in both cases, if a single entity deviates from the agreement, it can undo the work of the rest of the stakeholders no matter where they are across the ecosystem. So today we will be showcasing how the steps of the EA approach to management have been undertaken in the past by co-management agreements in large marine ecosystem number 12. So you can see here that the Bering Strait is between Alaska and Russia. And you can also see that it is the southern portion of large marine ecosystem number 12 of the northern Bering and Chukchi Seas. This map here is important because it shows the importance of marine mammals and their relative abundance. And due to this relative abundance in this area and the shallow character of the Bering Strait, it is considered the most productive continental shelf system. So moving from that, so now we're zooming out a little bit, and it's easy to see the international scale, but what is not as easy to see is the regional to tribal or local to international scales that are occurring in this region within the different co-management agreements. So I specifically look at bowhead whale, polar bear, and Pacific walrus. And all three of these marine mammals migrate internationally, and so therefore, unsurprisingly, they have or are in the process of obtaining an international agreement between the United States and Russia in this case. All three of these species are also relevant to this region because of their relationships to one another within the ecosystem, and also because of their human interactions over the last few centuries. So for example, commercial whaling was heightened in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Bering Strait region, and the number of bowhead whale decreased rapidly. But when this happened, polar bear and Pacific walrus were also incorporated into the trade in order to maintain revenues. So meaning that this fallout from whaling then cascaded onto these other marine mammals. Today we have other concerns other than whaling, such as increased shipping, and also due to sea ice melt, which is breaking up parts of the highly productive area, but also seen as making it accessible to creatures such as bowhead whale. And also these human activities are disrupting or at least changing or causing them to adapt different migrations and foraging patterns of these three species. And finally, regarding local stakeholders, these changes really threaten local stakeholders for traditional hunting and whaling. So using that interview, let's look at bowhead whale. So when looking at the EA framework up here in the top right corner, bowhead whale co-management has addressed all of these 6 steps at different times or at different iterations of the process, including management in the form of harvesting, of monitoring, of different methodologies using and reporting. But why is this specific bowhead whale population important in the region? Well, whaling has been critical in the Bering Strait for millennia, and they provide a significant amount of fats and vitamin C consumed in the region. Not coincidentally, their ecological importance includes the fact that bowhead whale are the only baleen whale that spends their entire lives in these waters near the sea ice, and that they have the thickest blubber of any marine mammal. Due to the size of bowhead whales and the coordination in order to harvest them, we see that bowhead whale have really created a two-way relationship with local communities in the southern portion of large marine ecosystem number 12. So looking at the steps now in that top right corner, Martin alluded to this earlier, but in the 1970s there were conflicting descriptions of bowhead whale and their migrations and what was happening of this ecosystem. So in that time, International Whaling Commission was backed by Western science, and they believed that bowhead whale, like other whales, had a very different migration than what local communities were believing at the time. And so with these conflicting descriptions, this led to different assessments of the ecosystem, essentially. And with this understanding that bowhead whale left the Arctic, the International Whaling Commission published that their estimate of the bowhead whale population numbered at less than 1,000. This ecosystem assessment led to specific management of human activities, which significantly reduced the quota for bowhead whale. So this led to different social activities that were happening locally within the region, and the following year, whalers and families declared intentions to rather go to jail than to abide by this quota because they had a very different description and understanding of the ecosystem. So through all of this, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission was established in 1977, and 2 years later, we see a glimmer of co-management as the U.S. government invites the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission to Washington, D.C. And they discuss a cooperative agreement for regulating whaling and to carry out another population estimate. As seen as the image on the far right side, large marine ecosystem number 12's bowhead whale population's migration is understood to travel along both the Alaskan and the Chukotkin coast, and you can see it's fairly cyclical. Using that description of the ecosystem to the right, and then now looking to the left, you can see that the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission at that time estimated 4 to 5 times as many bowhead whale as what the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, or what the International Whaling Commission had estimated in 1977. So with that background, and before we look at the successes today, I'm going to give some background on the Alaska Chukotka polar bear population, which also has an agreement. And interestingly enough, you can see that they reside and inhabit a pretty similar area to the bowhead whale in the Bering Strait. And what's really important here to remember is that this EA framework and co-management are both iterative processes. So I would argue through my research that the current iteration of the polar bear management is weaker than previous iterations, whether it's due to economics or politics influencing economic support, but it shouldn't affect why they are important to the region. So we know that the Chukotka Alaska polar bear population was first addressed in international law through that 1973 agreement that we heard about briefly from Nicole earlier. And that agreement banned the killing of polar bears except for scientific pursuits and for indigenous populations in these areas as well. And this agreement's important because it's definitely one of the first agreements that the Arctic 5 successfully negotiated to address circumpolar concern. So narrowing in back onto this population specifically, though, there were concerns after the dissolution of the USSR in the early 1990s. The first concern had to do with the assessment of the ecosystem or even describing it, because the certainty around the number of polar bear in the region decreased and knowledge about poaching was increasing. So a second concern that came out at that time was based on the management of human activities. Since the nature of the 1973 agreement was largely unenforceable and that poaching was occurring. So how did co-management address these concerns? Well, the U.S.-Russia Polar Bear Treaty was signed in 2000, and the implementation legislation came about in 2007, and it crossed scales that are visible on this map, such as the communities you can see on there, as well as ones that are not as visible. But what's really important is understanding it through the goals. So the first goal of the treaty was to meet the subsistence needs of these communities, and that's visible on this map. Secondly, indigenous knowledge was wanted to be used as the description of the ecosystem, and it was used by the four-member commission to make management decisions. Thirdly, we can look at the effort to value the ecosystem. The agreement identified shared sustainable harvest. And fourth and finally, the agreement's assessment of the ecosystem. And this was done by integrating both scientific data and traditional ecological knowledge within the whole region into the management of the Alaska Chukota polar bear population. So with all of this and coming from those first goals, we have the agreement's four-member commission, which includes both indigenous and governmental representatives from the US and Russia in order to make this four-person body. So this here is specifically work that I've done to aggregate these different components of the agreement, and in order to understand that, I broke them into these four categories. So in order to answer what do these agreements make possible, or how is co-management assisting the Bering Strait region, they are broken into these, and these are used specifically as relative effectiveness of international environmental agreements, and so we're looking at incentives, norms, capacities, and information. So I have also added some quantitative results on here to emphasize successes of the two agreements. And we'll just talk about the ones with yellow stars I'll go through on there, because there are also shortcomings or weaknesses of the agreements are listed as well. So starting with incentives of polar bear, in the 1990s, local interest and involvement in the government-led management of this polar bear population increased. And the increase is a direct result of, there's a lot of influences, but one of them is the 1988 Inuvialuit-Inupiaq Agreement, which we've heard about from a number of people today and learned a lot more about, especially also regarding beluga whale. The agreement produced data, and a lot of this data was gathered in a large part from local communities. And this data was used to support the food security of the two species. So therefore, this agreement provides a framework for the polar bear agreement's four goals that we heard about that had to do with including local knowledge, that had to do with the four-person commission between the US and Russia, and including those different scales of stakeholders. Additionally, without this agreement, it's possible that the four-member commission would be quite different. So what we can see as a success coming from the incentives for the polar bear agreement here is that this is a 20-year-old example of a best practice from one large marine ecosystem being adapted for another large marine ecosystem. So going from that Inuvialuit agreement to going into the Bering Strait. So now moving over to bowhead whale, but staying with incentives, I have the 1975-76 selective moratorium, which ended up resulting in the establishment of the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. And this one is really important because what this moratorium was threatening, and it was threatening at that time, or what we see now is like food security, but as Caroline was talking about yesterday, it was food security in a broad sense. And because bowhead are so well integrated into these communities, telling communities that they could not hunt them was threatening a lot more than just the calories that they were intaking. So moving down to the establishment of the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission and what has been undertaken by this commission, I'll start with the 1981 cooperative agreement that they signed with NOAA. This cooperative agreement resulted in several of the other regional capacities we see here, and many of them were assuming roles as monitors and observers for harvest. Due to this cooperation, the Beaufort Bering Chukchi bowhead whale population boasts a 98 to 100% reporting of harvest attempts today, which is a really high rate. Also, this positive trend for the bowhead whale population, as seen on the previous slide, is an indicator of the degree of these successes. The 1977 estimate for bowhead whale by the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission was under 5,000. The most recent estimate from 2011 that was collaborated on by a number of the capacities in that far right column was at around, well, exactly 16,892. So that is a 3.5% increase for an annual rate. And then a few more successes here, jumping down to the information sector at the bottom and looking at the clear communication of duties, which is really important for co-management if we want to see successes. And this has definitely happened more with the Bowhead Whale Agreement. We have one of these that we can talk about is the cooperative work that has been undertaken in order to carry out these 4 population estimates that have happened about every 10 years. So that includes a number of the capacities, but everybody having specific duties. Also on this, we have the 2011 estimate, which had a 95% confidence interval. Okay. And another result of this is the collective action of shareholders, such as the efficiency rate of the bowhead whale hunts has increased since the 70s by about 20%. A third success is regarding the collaboration of these capacities. So this includes industry. And Martin spoke about this a lot and talked about the 30 years that it took to come to this sort of collaboration. But these conflict avoidance agreements are able to collectively mitigate concerns, whether it has to do with vessels, which we know are increasing now in the region, or different discharges that's also going to be increasing with those increasing vessels. So to conclude on the successes that we can see from co-management in the Bering Strait and large marine ecosystem number 12, this happened because the efforts are focused on the species, but also on their habitat and on the human involvement in a lot of different skills or coming from outside the region into the region. Bowhead whale management's number one factor that has, so this is really important, is that it has led to their current consideration to be delisted from the Endangered Species Act. So that is another success that we can see coming from these agreements. So in conclusion, it's important that a lot of these successes are shared as best practices from one large marine ecosystem to another. So if there's one takeaway, I would say that it's important to remember that this is already occurring. Here's our local example of the Nunavut Agreement being used and then being used to help guide the Bering Strait Agreement. And then the showcase successes of international agreements for polar bear and bowhead whale, they've produced cross-scale collaborations through the northern Bering Chukchi Seas. The steadily increasing population numbers of the bowhead whales legitimize the successes. However, the current challenges being faced in the Bering Strait, such as sea ice melt or increased shipping, are being encountered across. So as we can see from this map, a lot of concerns are pan-Arctic. And that doesn't mean that the ecosystems are similar. It just means that best practices could be adapted and that sharing that information could be useful. So no, it shouldn't be exactly the same because so many other factors are different. But what is important is that there are successes happening that should be applied elsewhere. So therefore, for my final conclusion, I would just like to say that today spoke about bowhead whale and polar bear, but I'm also studying Pacific walrus. So if anybody else has information from other large marine ecosystems that you think would be great insights on Pacific walrus, I would love to talk to you more about that. Thank you for your attention.